They called him the Lion of England, the man who tore a nation away from Rome and remade it in his own image. He commanded armies, executed queens, and bent popes to his will. But behind the glittering armor and velvet robes, behind the portraits that show power frozen in paint, Henry VIII was dying from the inside out. His flesh was rotting, his blood was poisoned, and his court was a palace of stench. This was not the story of a glorious king, it was the slow, wet collapse of a man who could command the world, but not his own body. When Henry died in the year 1547, his coffin burst open from the pressure of decay. The gases inside exploded through the lead, and dogs were said to lick the fluids that leaked from the cracks. His body had become a biological warning, swollen, infected, and filled with pus from head to toe. Yet this ending had been written long before his death. Every ulcer, every meal, every delusion was a chapter in the anatomy of destruction. It began in the year 1536, when the king fell from his armoured horse during a joust. The impact shattered his leg, and with it, his life. The wound never healed. For 11 years it oozed blood and pus, wrapped in filthy linen reused again and again. Courtiers could smell him before they saw him. The stench of rotting flesh drifted through the halls of Whitehall like an invisible fog. Servants would burn the bandages after changing them, but the odour clung to their hair and clothes as if the king himself had branded them with it. And when the infection deepened, when the leg became a crater of dying tissue, the royal physicians heated iron rods until they glowed orange and pressed them into his skin. The palace echoed with screams. That was what passed for medicine. The pain did not just eat his leg, it consumed his mind. Chronic agony twisted Henry's temper into madness. Once a charming prince, he became a paranoid tyrant. Every step hurt. Every breath reminded him that his body was turning against him. He ordered wives to the scaffold and friends to the block, while the real enemy, infection, kept eating through his bones. Modern doctors believe he suffered from osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that causes unending agony. Imagine living every day with your skeleton on fire, while your healers insisted it was God's will. But the leg was only the beginning. His bowels failed him next. Henry ate like a god and digested like a corpse. Meat, sugar, ale, endless feasts that left him chronically constipated. He would sit on his velvet-lined commode for hours, grunting and cursing, while nobles pretended not to hear. When nothing came, the physicians attacked him with enemas. Gallons of wine, oil, and vinegar forced into his body through a metal tube until the king screamed and the chamber overflowed. They called it cleansing the humours. It was torture disguised as treatment. He bled from his hemorrhoids, fainted from exhaustion, and still the physicians cheered that the corruption had been expelled. His mouth rotted next. Henry was addicted to sugar, the sweetest symbol of wealth in Tudor England, and his teeth blackened to stumps. Abscesses formed in his gums and burst into his throat, flooding his tongue with the taste of pus and iron. His breath could empty a room. When a barber surgeon finally pulled his teeth, there was no anesthesia, only wine and iron pliers. Sometimes the tooth shattered, leaving splinters behind to fester. Still, he smiled for portraits, lips tight, pretending the pain wasn't real. His eyes wept. His ears oozed. His sinuses filled with yellow mucus that dripped constantly down his throat. The court could hear him hacking in the night, snorting into handkerchiefs that servants threw away because they were too foul to wash. His body was a network of infections, one continuous wound that could talk, sign documents, and order executions. Even his skin rebelled. Boils burst across his back. Carbuncles grew on his neck, and rashes festered beneath the folds of fat that hung from his belly. He was once the most athletic man in Europe, By his last years, he weighed nearly 400 pounds and had to be lifted onto his throne by servants using a mechanical chair. And yet he believed he was clean. He rarely bathed, because Tudor medicine claimed that water opened the pores and let disease in. Instead, the king washed with linen cloths, dipped in rose water. He wore the same layers of silk and fur until they were soaked with sweat and decay. Fleas crawled in the seams. Lice lived in his beard. Bedbugs feasted on his royal flesh. Even his courtiers developed techniques to survive his presence, holding herbs to their noses, breathing through their mouths, standing upwind while pretending to admire the tapestries. To meet the king was to smell death. Still, no one dared tell him. Power silenced, disgust. When foreign ambassadors fainted from the odour, Henry assumed it was the heat. When physicians failed to heal him, he accused them of treason. And when his body finally began to liquefy, he refused to admit that anything was wrong. His courtiers whispered prayers as his body swelled. His face puffed, and his legs split open one last time, leaking what was left of his life onto the floor. On a cold night in January, the year 1547, the man who had murdered wives, broken a church, and devoured a kingdom lay, gasping for air. His heart failed under the weight of his own flesh. His body filled with fluid, and his breath rattled like a broken bellows. When he died, England exhaled, and his corpse began to explode. The coffin cracked. The gases burst, and the dogs came to lick the king, who had believed himself untouchable. The Palace of Splendor became a mausoleum of rot. This is the story. No portrait dares to tell the king who ruled an empire and drowned in his own filth. His death was not an accident. It was the final chapter of arrogance of a man too proud to wash, too powerful to be told the truth, and too human to escape decay. And if that doesn't make you grateful for soap and running water, nothing will. There was a job in Henry's palace that no one dared joke about aloud, though whispers slithered through the tapestries when the doors were closed and the torches burned low. It was called the groom of the stool, and it was both the most degrading and most powerful position a man could hold in Tudor England. Imagine kneeling before the King of England, not to beg for mercy, not to present a petition, but to wipe him clean after he relieved himself. Yet it was no ordinary service, it was sacred, intimate, and terrible. A ritual of filth wrapped in the velvet of privilege. The groom would wait in the royal privy, a small chamber perfumed with rose petals but unable to hide the smell of digestion and decay, while Henry sat upon his close stool, a portable throne lined with crimson velvet and fitted with a chamber pot. As the king strained and groaned, courtiers stood nearby, pretending not to hear the sounds of human misery that echoed from behind the screen. Business continued even then. Ambassadors were received, treaty discussed, decisions made, all while the king's body performed its most mortal function. When Henry was done, the groom stepped forward, dipped a linen cloth into rose water, and completed his duty with reverence, as though handling something divine. He would then examine what remained, note the texture and colour, and report to the physicians. This, they believed, was medical science. For the groom, it was something closer to martyrdom. The heat in that chamber was suffocating, thick with the mingled scents of unwashed flesh, spoiled meat, and the sickly sweetness of perfume meant to disguise rot. The king's diet had turned his insides into a furnace of corruption. His stool, a chemical weapon that only the bravest could face without flinching. And yet these men were not servants from the kitchen or stable. They were nobles, educated, titled, the sons of England's finest families. To serve the king at his most private moment was to have his ear in all other moments. The groom of the stool could whisper counsel while holding the damp cloth. He could secure favours, grand access, sway decision. Power came from proximity, and there was no one closer than the man who cleaned the king's body with his own hands. But that power came at a price that could not be spoken, the smell clinging to the skin, the sight that haunted the eyes, the memory of a king's pain and his own quiet degradation. Henry's body made this task a torment. His hemorrhoids were swollen and raw, his skin torn and inflamed from endless straining. Some days he would wince and bark orders while the groom worked, his voice thick with anger and humiliation. Other days, he was silent, trembling, his face slick with sweat, his breath heavy with wine and sickness. There were times when nothing came at all, when the king sat for an hour, while his courtiers shifted on aching legs, pretending to admire the tapestries while the air turned foul. The groom could not leave. He knelt, waiting, hands folded, the weight of the royal stomach pressing on the moment like fate itself. If the king succeeded, there was relief. If not, rage. Once, a groom flinched at the sound of a sudden groan, and Henry, noticing, fixed him with a glare so cold that the man fainted. Another groom began to drink heavily before each shift, trying to dull his senses. It was said that he smelled of ale even before he entered the chamber. Henry noticed that too, and soon he was gone. No one knew where. The physicians praised these grooms as instruments of health, but they were instruments of fear. They carried the burden of a king's body and the secrets of his sickness. In the still hours of dawn, before the palace awoke, they burned the linens used the day before. Watching the smoke rise and curl like ghosts above the Thames, they prayed silently that the king's bowels would be merciful that morning, that his temper would not explode like his wounds, that they would survive another day in the shadow of his flesh. The irony was cruel. The cleanest men in court were those who lived surrounded by filth. They washed constantly, rubbed their hands with vinegar, perfumed themselves with lavender. But the odor of Henry's illness clung like invisible armor, even in church, even at feasts. People could tell who they were by the faint trace of corruption that followed them like a curse. As the years passed and the leg wound worsened, the duty grew more dangerous. The infection in Henry's body spread everywhere. The royal privy became a place of medical horror. When the king strained too hard, blood appeared, bright and shocking, sometimes spattering the floor. The groom would pretend not to see, but he saw everything. He saw the trembling hands gripping the wooden arms of the stool, the veins bulging in the king's neck, the wince of shame behind his fury. He knew when the pain was unbearable because the king stopped speaking. He knew when the fever rose because the sweat smelled of iron, and when the king's face turned purple with effort. He knew to call the physicians, who would arrive with their clysters and metal tubes, ready to purge the monarch once more. The groom stood back then, eyes down, hearing the cries that shook the chamber as gallons of liquid were forced into the royal body. When it was done, he returned to clean what remained, his hands steady, his voice soft. "Your Majesty, it is finished." And then he would bow and leave, shaking, the sound of the king's moans still echoing in his skull. Yet despite the horror, despite the humiliation, men competed for this role. To wipe the king was to touch the pulse of the realm itself. Every secret passed through that chamber, letters read aloud, whispers of war, gossip of wives and rivals. The groom of the stool knew more than any minister or ambassador. He knew when the king's strength faltered and when his rage burned brightest. He could sense the tides of power by the tension in the royal gut. And so, beneath the filth, beneath the smell and shame, there was influence invisible, intoxicating, and lethal. More than one groom rose high in Henry's favor. only to fall just as swiftly. Accused of betrayal or mockery, none could forget that to serve the body of a tyrant was to risk the blade that guarded his pride. By the final years, when Henry's body had become a fortress of pus and sweat, the grooms were almost monks, performing a ritual of mercy amid decay. They moved through his chambers quietly, bearing towels and rosewater, avoiding the gaze of courtiers who despised them and envied them at once. They learned to hold their breath at just the right moments, to speak gently when pain made the king cruel, to retreat without a sound when his temper darkened. They became shadows indispensable, invisible, enduring, and when he died, it was said that one groom wept more than any of his queens, not for love, but for release. For years he had served the body that was England's ruin, watched it crumble, carried its secrets, cleaned its wounds, and buried his own humanity beneath its weight. When the coffin burst, when the fluids leaked into the church floor, he was not there, but perhaps he imagined it. Perhaps he thought that the king, at last, had wiped himself clean. The court never spoke of these men again. Their names faded, their records lost, as though history itself could not bear to remember the touch that made kings human. Yet they remain a ghostly reminder of how close power lies to humiliation, how thin the veil between majesty and decay. Every empire has its grooms. Every ruler, someone who bears the filth they refuse to see. And in the story of Henry VIII, none suffered more nobly, or more silently, than the men who knelt beside his throne of rot and called it duty. The infection that had begun in Henry's leg was more than a wound. It was a prophecy, a slow curse that foretold his end. The year after the jousting accident, courtiers whispered that the king had changed, not only in flesh, but in spirit. He no longer rode out to hunt with the same roaring laughter, nor danced until dawn as he once had with his queens and courtiers. Instead, he limped through his chambers, heavy and irritable, the sound of his cane striking stone echoing like the tick of a clock counting down his final years. Servants learned to vanish when they heard it. The rhythm of the king's footsteps meant danger. If it stopped suddenly, someone was about to die. The pain from the leg was relentless, a constant, gnawing fire beneath the skin. When the ulcer broke open, it oozed a mixture of blood, pus, and a black substance that the physicians called the corruption. They tried to draw it out with poultices made of egg whites, honey, and rose petals, believing that sweetness could lure poison. It did not. Each time they unwrapped the wound, the smell was unbearable. Courtiers had to turn their faces away and breathe through handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar. The king saw their revulsion, and it cut deeper than the pain itself. He began to trust no one, not even those who tended his leg. There were nights when the pain became so severe that the king screamed until dawn. The physicians, desperati, would heat metal instruments until they glowed, and cauterize the wound to seal the evil spirits within. The hiss of burning flesh filled the room, the sound of a man becoming his own pyre. The attendants would hold him down, their faces pale with terror. As the smell of cooking meat spread through the palace corridors, outside, the courtiers poured wine and whispered prayers. They said the king's screams were a sign of divine punishment for his sins, for the blood of wives he had spilled and the church he had broken. But no one said it too loudly. They all knew what happened to those who spoke of God's judgment in the wrong company. Henry himself, when the agony passed, would sink into silence, sweat dripping from his hair, and mutter that pain was proof of God's favor. He believed, or tried to believe, that he suffered as kings must suffer, bearing the sickness of a nation within his own flesh. Yet even he could not ignore the smell of decay that followed him wherever he went. the sour perfume of death that no amount of perfume or incense could hide. The ulcer was not just a wound, it was an empire unto itself. It pulsed. It wept. It ruled his body. Physicians came and went, offering remedies that failed, and excuses that sounded like prayers. One claimed that the wound was a blessing, that it drew out evil humors and kept the king alive. Another warned that if it ever fully healed, the poison trapped inside would rush to his heart and kill him instantly. So they kept it open deliberately. They reopened it with knives, drained it with cups, and packed it with herbs that stung like fire. The more they treated it, the worse it grew. Henry endured it all, too proud to admit defeat, too frightened to stop. When the fever came, he spoke nonsense, muttering names of wives, long dead, orders of execution already carried out. The attendant said his eyes glowed fever-bright. His words slurred into Latin prayers and curses in the same breath. And when the fever broke, he would order fresh meat, fresh wine, fresh pleasures, as if to remind the court that he was still their god-king, still the master of his fate. Even as his body rotted in rebellion, the infection changed more than his body. It poisoned his mind. Pain became the lens through which he saw the world. Every slight felt sharper, every doubt a threat. He dismissed old friends, accused loyal ministers of betrayal, executed those who hesitated even a moment before answering his questions. His moods swung like a pendulum, 1 hour jovial, generous, handing out jewels and titles. The next, red-faced with fury, shouting for the headsman. Courtiers learned to read his face like scripture, searching for signs of weather in his expression. A single frown could mean the tower. His paranoia was not born from cruelty alone, but from exhaustion, from the maddening ache that never left him. Pain stripped him of sleep, stripped him of reason. Chronic agony does not make monsters, it reveals them. In Henry, it revealed something vast and pitiless. And yet, there were moments when the mask slipped, when the man behind the crown appeared. Late at night, when the fire burned low and only his most trusted attendants remained, he would lift the bandages himself and stare at the wound as though it were a mirror. The skin around it was grey and soft, the flesh sunken and cratered. Sometimes he would prod it with trembling fingers, watching the pus bubble out, and whisper, "So this is what I have become." No one dared answer. He would sit that way for hours, lost in the horror of his own mortality, until at last he demanded wine and music to drown it. His musicians would play softly in the adjoining chamber lutes, flutes, and the faint hum of voices, but the sound could not hide the smell. It rose and lingered, curling through the rafters like incense for a dying god. The infection spread beyond the leg. His entire system was inflamed. Red blotches appeared on his skin. Ulcers broke out on his back, and his ankles swelled until his boots no longer fit. The pain of walking became unbearable. He ordered a mechanical chair to be built so he could be carried up and down the stairs. The sight of it, massive, ornate, made of gold and oak, was meant to display majesty. But everyone saw what it truly was, a throne for a man who could no longer stand. The king who once leapt onto horses now needed to be hoisted like a carcass. And still, no one dared speak of weakness. When foreign ambassadors wrote home, they described the monarch in polite lies: robust, energetic, imposing. The truth was unspeakable. England was ruled by a man who stank of pus and fever. At times, Henry believed his suffering was divine punishment. Other times, he thought himself cursed by witchcraft. He accused his wives of bewitching him, his ministers of poisoning him, his doctors of incompetence. He ordered new treatments, stranger ones. Physicians bled him until he fainted, drained his veins to cool the humours. But his fever only worsened. They purged him with mercury and antimony until his bowels burned. They prayed over the wound, rubbed it with gold leaf, and even applied crushed pearls to draw out corruption. All failed. The leg continued to fester, a wound that laughed at kingship and faith alike. By the end of the decade, Henry could not hide the truth even from himself. His clothes were stained with fluid. The smell of his body filled every room. Servants fainted, courtiers wretched behind gloved hands. He had become the embodiment of decay, a king alive and dead at once. In his nightmares, he dreamed of fire, of burning flesh, of the sound of hooves crushing bone. He would wake screaming, clutching his leg, convinced that the horse from the joust still pinned him beneath its weight. He would demand that the priests pray louder, that the torches burn brighter, as if light and prayer could drive back the infection crawling through his veins. But no light could reach that deep, and no prayer could redeem the flesh that had long since become its own grave. And so, every morning, the bandages were changed, the wound was reopened, and the cycle began again. The man who ruled the mightiest throne in Christendom could not conquer the smallest enemy of all the unseen rot that lived inside him, eating the king 1 inch at a time. By the time Henry reached his late 40s, his body had become a battlefield, and every day was another campaign against himself. The leg still oozed, the fever still came in waves, and yet he feasted as if gluttony were his only cure. Meals became spectacles of denial, feasts of defiance. Tables spent under roasted swans, stuffed peacocks, mountains of venison, and rivers of ale. Servants carried trays, dripping with fat and sugar, and the air shimmered with the heat of kitchens that never slept. To the world, these banquets were proof of the king's prosperity. But to those who stood near him, it was clear that every bite was another act of desperation. Henry ate because eating made him feel alive. He drank because it dulled the pain for a moment. He laughed too loudly, spoke too fast, and pretended not to notice when courtiers exchanged glances over the way his hands trembled. When the music played, he demanded dances. He could no longer join. He clapped, wheezed, and cheered while others spun. His smile stretched thin over a face that had grown as pale as dough. Beneath the silk, his flesh was soft and swollen, a kingdom of infection held together by pride and fear. At night, when the revels ended and the halls grew silent, the king's groans filled the void. Servants crept in with fresh bandages and trays of ointments that stank of vinegar and decay. They tried to move gently, but every touch made him flinch. The ulcer on his leg had grown deep enough to expose bone. Sometimes, in the flicker of candlelight, it glistened like ivory beneath a film of pus. Flies gathered even in winter, drawn to the warmth of the wound. The physicians came and went, each promising a miracle, each leaving with the same haunted look. They were learned men, confident in their humours and their leeches. But this infection mocked them. No bleeding could drain it. No potion could calm it. The king's body had become a laboratory of suffering, a place where superstition and science blended into madness. One night, a new physician suggested bathing the leg in wine boiled with gold dust, believing the purity of metal might draw out evil spirits. The concoction hissed when it touched the wound. Henry howled, struck the table, and demanded the man's head. He lived, but never returned. The leg was not the only horror. Henry's digestion, already ruined, became a kind of living torture. Constipation chained him to his private stool for hours, his face red and glistening, his body trembling with effort. When he could not go, the physicians forced him to, with their enemas, tubes of brass and bladders of pigskin pumping wine, oil, or vinegar into his bowels. It was a grotesque ritual, to performed in silence, except for the king's gasps. Sometimes, the pressure inside him became so great that he screamed, and when the flood finally came, the smell drove even seasoned attendants to the verge of fainting. Afterward, Henry would slump forward, shaking, his lips cracked, his eyes dull with exhaustion. He would wave them away and mutter, "God purges his own." Then, once he caught his breath, he would ask for food again. The cycle repeated endlessly, eating, suffering, purging, bleeding. The court revolved around the rhythm of his sickness like planets circling a dying sun. By then, the leg wound had done more than poison his flesh. It had poisoned his mind. He could no longer trust anyone. He suspected plots in every whisper, poison in every cup. Even the air seemed treacherous to him. Courtiers tiptoed through the palace, speaking in rehearsed tones of devotion, terrified that a wrong word might cost them their lives. He had eyes everywhere, spies, informants, frightened servants desperate to survive by telling him what he wanted to hear. Yet nothing satisfied him. The pain in his leg had fused with the pain in his heart, until every person he saw reminded him of betrayal. The faces of his wives haunted him, Catherine's stoic sorrow, Anne's wild defiance, Jane's parlour gentleness, Catherine Howard's youthful terror. Sometimes, as fever blurred his vision, he would call them by name, accusing them of witchcraft, cursing their ghosts for cackling at his decay. Then, when the fever broke, he would weep and whisper their names like prayers, half believing they still watched over him, the half fearing they waited for him in the dark. Sleep became his rarest mercy. When it came, it was shallow, full of dreams where his body dissolved into worms and mud. He would wake, gasping, clutching the sheets soaked with sweat and blood, calling for wine. The servants who brought it kept their faces turned away. They could not look at him. The skin of his legs had turned black and glossy. The ulcer dripped constantly. At times, it burst, flooding the floor with thick, yellow fluid that made the torches flicker. The stench crept under doors and through tapestries until the entire palace seemed infected. Courtiers perfumed their gloves, burned incense, held cloves under their tongues. The king himself no longer noticed the smell. His body had adapted to its own decay. When foreign ambassadors came, the rooms were aired for hours beforehand. Curtains were drawn open, fires smothered, herbs burned in every corner. Even so, the stench lingered. Ambassadors wrote home in secret letters that the King of England exudes the odour of a dead man. One fainted during an audience. Henry took it as an insult and banned him from court. To the end. His pride was a wall no stench could breach. He still demanded his portraits show him as broad-shouldered, Majestats, the conqueror of France, and hearts alike. He ordered painters to smooth the lines on his face, to widen his stance, to hide the shadow beneath his eyes. The image endured eternal power, eternal virility, while the truth beneath the brushstrokes grew more monstrous each day. In those final years, his body became his kingdom's secret. It was forbidden to speak of his illness. Servants who whispered about it vanished. Physicians signed oaths of silence under threat of death. The great courts of Europe continued to receive letters from England describing their monarch as strong, wise, active in governance. None mentioned that he could barely stand, that he was carried from chamber to chamber by sweating men who feared dropping him. None mentioned the bandages that soaked through before noon, The ulcers that leaked onto the marble floors, the royal robe stained from within. The illusion had to live, even as the man beneath it rotted. Sometimes, in moments of lucidity, Henry seemed to understand. He would look into the fire and say softly that kings were not meant to decay like common men, that God's anointed should die in glory, not in pus. But when his priests told him that his suffering was divine purification, he clung to the thought, better to be cleansed by pain than destroyed by shame. He began to see the rot as proof of favour, his torment as evidence that he carried England's sins upon him. It was a delusion, but it gave him meaning. And so he endured, a living relic of pride and disease. The king, who could command armies, but not his own flesh. The courtiers continued to bow, the musicians continued to play, and the palace continued to glow with candlelight, even as the walls themselves seemed to breathe with the faint, sweet odour of corruption. Henry had become the empire of rot itself, and no one dared call it by name. By the spring of his final decade, the king, who had once thundered across tournament fields, could barely lift his own weight. His world shrank to a few dim chambers filled with the smell of candle wax, sweat, and the sour breath of infection. The bed had become both his throne and his prison. Sheets of the finest linen stuck to his skin, soaked with fluids from his leg wound, and servants changed them constantly, though the stench never left. The heavy curtains were drawn to block drafts that might anger the humours, but the result was suffocating heat, the kind that made the air taste of sickness. Courtiers entered only when summoned and stayed as briefly as possible, bowing low, eyes on the floor, their faces frozen in masks of loyalty while their stomachs churned. Henry noticed every grimace, every held breath, and his paranoia deepened. He accused men of treachery for covering their noses, and the priests who dared bring incense were commanded never to mention why. It was as though the entire kingdom conspired to deny that its king was decomposing while still alive. Every attempt at healing only fed the disease. Physicians bled him until he fainted, drained cups of his royal blood into basins of polished silver, and declared the operation a success when his colour turned grey. They purged him with bitter draughts, forced mercury down his throat until he vomited, and pressed hot irons against his leg in the name of cleansing. The ulcers closed and reopened in cycles of false hope. One morning he awoke, claiming that the pain had vanished, that God had healed him at last. By evening, fever seized him, and the leg burst open again, releasing pus, so thick it stuck to the floorboards. The servants who cleaned it whispered that the devil himself lived in that wound. No one contradicted them. The infection had become part of the palace, a presence that lingered in every corridor, invisible yet unmistakable. In his long hours of delirium, Henry began to talk to shadows. He spoke to his mother, to his dead wives, to the saints he had once defied. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he wept. Sometimes he called for Anne Boleyn, as if she still waited for him in the next room. When consciousness returned, shame turned his voice to steel. He roared at his attendants, threatened execution for imagined insults, and accused them of plotting to hasten his death. Non eddered reply. Even the sound of his rage was terrifying. A hoarse, wet roar that came from somewhere deep inside a body that no longer belonged to him. Pain had stripped him of his humanity, leaving behind a creature made of hunger, authority, and fear. He demanded more food, though he could hardly swallow. Demanded more wine, though it made him choke. Demanded silence, even as he screamed. The meals continued, rituals of denial carried out with trembling hands. Dishes of roasted venison and spiced boar were placed before him. Though he barely touched them, he would slice one bite, chew it slowly, then push the plate away, claiming it was too cold or too tough or too tasteless. Then he would summon musicians to play softly while he stared into nothing. Sometimes he ordered his cooks to taste the food in front of him, convinced that poison lurked in every dish. One chef collapsed from exhaustion after working 3 nights without sleep, and Henry had him flogged for sloth. The court began to resemble a hospital crossed with a slaughterhouse, half of its people tending to the king's sickness, the other half trying not to be noticed by him at all. Power itself had become contagious, and no one wanted to catch it. The ulcer was not content with flesh alone. It reached inward, spreading through blood and bone until his entire body seemed to rebel. His legs swelled like barrels, the skin shiny and purple, the pressure so intense that fluid leaked from the pores. When he stood, which was rare, the sound of his joints crackling filled the silence. His hands, once strong enough to pull a bow, shook uncontrollably. He could no longer hold a sword or write his name without assistance. And still, he insisted that he was the same king who had conquered France, the same man whose word had shattered the church. He spoke of victory and destiny while the servants behind him wiped blood from the floor. Denial was his last armor. Pride, his final weapon. Sleep offered no peace. The ulcers throbbed at night, each heartbeat a hammer against his skull. When exhaustion claimed him, his dreams were violent. He saw himself burning, felt the weight of his armor crushing his chest, saw his legs split open to reveal writhing worms that spoke with his own voice. He would wake gasping, clawing at the wound, shouting for light. The attendants would rush in with torches, afraid of the dark as much as he was. They said the king's chambers glowed like a tomb filled with fire. The priests prayed over him, murmuring Latin verses drowned out by his groans. He begged them for forgiveness, but never said what for. The sins of his body and the sins of his soul had become the same. As the seasons turned, his mind deteriorated. He forgot names, confused faces, repeated orders that had already been carried out. Sometimes he spoke kindly to a servant, thanked him for loyalty, and within the hour demanded his execution for imagined treason. The council feared him as much as they pitied him. The court functioned in fragments letters signed by trembling secretaries, decrees whispered rather than spoken. England was being ruled by a ghost that refused to die. Outside, the people heard rumors that the king was ill, but none could imagine the truth. They still pictured the broad-shouldered monarch of their coins and tapestries, not the bloated figure struggling for breath behind shuttered windows. One afternoon, as the fever burned especially high, Henry demanded that his physicians open the wound once more. They hesitated, knowing that the last cauterization had nearly killed him, but he roared until they obeyed. The iron was heated until it glowed like the sun, and the stench that filled the room when it touched his skin made strong men gag. The sound of his scream shook the rafters. When it was over, he fainted, and for a moment they thought he was dead. Yet he lived, somehow, clinging to life out of stubbornness, or vengeance, or fear. The wound steamed in the cold air, a pit of ruin that no medicine could close. That night, one of the grooms confessed that he dreamed of the leg speaking, whispering threats in the voice of its owner. No one laughed. By now, his entire body leaked in some way, blood from his gums, pus from his leg, sweat from every fold of his flesh. His breath rattled like wind through a crypt. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and fury, grew dull and unfocused, clouded with infection. But still he insisted on being dressed each morning in his jewels and silks. They wrapped him like a corpse prepared for burial. Rings forced over swollen fingers. Brocades stretched across the mound of his belly. He would sit before a mirror, staring at his reflection, muttering prayers. No one dared remind him that mirrors were forbidden in sick rooms, that they were said to trap dying souls. Perhaps he already knew. Perhaps he wanted to watch himself fade. And so the days passed, heavy and airless, filled with the sound of dripping bandages and the rustle of fearful servants. Outside the palace, spring returned. Flowers bloomed, and London carried on as if its king were not decaying by inches behind his gilded doors. Inside, time had no meaning. The sun could not pierce those curtains, and the night never truly ended. Henry lived in a world of flickering light and endless pain, where every breath was a labor and every silence a warning. And through it all, the empire waited anxious, restless, pretending not to smell what everyone already knew. The King of England was dying, but he would not die clean. As the year turned, the corridors of Whitehall grew quieter, the echoes softer, as though even the palace itself had begun to hold its breath. The king's world had shrunk to the rhythm of his own agony, the slow pulse of infection, the muffled footsteps of those who still dared to serve him. The light in his chambers was always dim, filtered through curtains heavy with dust and the scent of mildew. The air hung thick, unmoving, tainted by the sweetness of decay that no perfume could erase. The fire burned low in the hearth, not for warmth but to keep the dampness from worsening the sores that now spread beyond his leg to his back. His arms, his chest, they bloomed like terrible flowers, red and swollen at first, then breaking open into pools of yellow. The healers called them carbuncles, but the servants whispered other names: God's wrath, the devil's kisses, the price of blood. They treated them as they treated all his wounds, with knives and heat and herbs steeped in vinegar. The screams could be heard through stone walls. At times, he would wake from fever thinking he was under siege, shouting orders to phantom soldiers, convinced that the French had breached the gates. The attendants would kneel at his bedside, soothing him, assuring him that the war was long won, that the realm was safe, but he never quite believed them. In his delirium, he thought he smelled the battlefield, the iron scent of blood mixed with the smoke of cannon fire. He muttered that the wound in his leg was a musket ball still lodged in the bone, that if they could only pull it out, he would be healed. They humoured him because contradiction could bring death faster than the disease itself. When the fever receded, he was left hollow-eyed and trembling, a ghost sitting upright in a golden bed. His body was collapsing, but his vanity clung to ceremony. Each morning, the ritual of dressing took hours. Servants lifted him, bathed his skin with linen soaked in wine, powdered the folds of his flesh to hide the oozing sores, and slid rings onto fingers swollen like sausages. He demanded to wear his great ruby, the heart of England, even though it dug into the soft flesh of his hand. When he saw himself in the mirror, he smiled faintly, not out of pride but disbelief. The reflection was both him and not him. A face puffed and colourless, eyes lost in folds of fat, mouth twisted as though half the muscles had forgotten their purpose. He whispered once to his barber that the mirror must be cursed, for no glass could show so cruel a truth. The barber said nothing, and that silence saved his life. Outside his chambers, courtiers gossiped about what had become of him, their voices hushed, yet hungry. Some swore that he was half dead already, and that ministers forged his signature. Others claimed he was possessed, that his groans at night were not of pain, but of demons leaving his body. None of them truly wanted to know. The closer one came to the king, the closer one came to death by contagion, by command, or by proximity to power that could no longer tell friend from foe. Ministers tiptoed around his moods like men walking a cliff's edge. The council met in small rooms, far from his hearing, issuing orders in his name, pretending that the monarch who ruled England was still the lion he had been. But everyone knew power had shifted from the bed to the whispers beyond its curtains. Henry, however, refused to yield. Even as his strength drained away, his mind clung to authority with claws of iron. He demanded updates from the council, interrogated servants about foreign affairs, summoned ambassadors to his bedside. They bowed low and struggled not to breathe. The smell of rot was thick enough to sting the eyes. One ambassador from Spain later wrote that approaching the king felt like entering a tomb that still spoke. And yet, for all his decay, Henry's words retained their force. He spoke of God's will, of legacy, of his son, who must inherit a kingdom unbroken. He spoke of order, of enemies, of eternity. The body was failing, but the will still ruled, fierce and blinding, as though he could outshout death itself. When pain overwhelmed him, he turned to the church. Priests filled his chamber like shadows, chanting prayers over his suppurating body. He confessed often, sometimes hourly, as if afraid that his sins might grow back between absolutions. But confession brought no peace. He wept, then cursed, then begged for mercy in the same breath. He promised to build churches, to feed the poor, to undo the wrongs he had done. Then, within the hour, he would rage again, demanding more wine, more music, more life. The contradiction tore him in two, one part desperate for heaven, the other still clutching the crown that had condemned him. The music he once loved now haunted him. Musicians played softly from behind a screen, but even the gentlest lute seemed to mock his decline. The sound of strings reminded him of laughter, of the youth he had lost, of dancing with Anne Boleyn beneath the torches of Hampton Court, when his heart had been wild and his legs strong. Sometimes he would close his eyes and see her dark eyes flashing, lips curved in mischief, and for a moment the pain would ease. Then the memory twisted. He would see her head falling, the axe bright as sunlight, and he would open his eyes gasping, sweat dripping from his chin. "She betrayed me," he would whisper to the ceiling. They all did. The priests said nothing. They knew that guilt and fever spoke the same language. The sores spread faster now. His back was a map of pain, his skin thin as parchment, tearing at the slightest touch. His nurses wrapped him in fresh linen each night, but by morning the cloths were soaked through. The flesh beneath was red and raw, the air heavy with the scent of infection. They changed the bandages quietly, whispering prayers as they worked. Once, when a young nurse hesitated at the sight of his ruined flesh, Henry's eyes snapped open. "Do you think me monstrous?" he rasped. She fell to her knees, trembling, but he only sighed. "I was God's image once," he murmured, "and now I am his warning." Then he turned his face away and did not speak again for hours. Outside, the winter wind moaned through the chimneys, and the river below the palace swelled with ice. Within, the king's body burned as if lit from inside. He slept fitfully, muttering the names of long-dead queens, fragments of Latin hymns, orders for wars that had ended years before. His attendants watched him drift between worlds, neither fully alive nor yet gone. Sometimes, in the blue light before dawn, they said his face looked peaceful, almost holy. But when the sun rose and the pain returned, he was once more the king raging, demanding, unwilling to surrender. The infection had claimed nearly everything: his strength, his sleep, his dignity, but not his will. That, even disease could not devour. He clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood, certain that as long as he could command, he could still exist. Yet each command came weaker, each breath shorter. The palace had become an echo chamber of his dying power. Every order repeated by trembling voices to remind England that its monarch still spoke. But even the echoes were fading, and beyond the walls, the cold waited patiently. Knowing that soon there would be silence, winter bled into another year. And by then, the King of England was more legend than man, a rumour shrouded in curtains and incense. No one saw him without permission, and those who did rarely spoke of it afterward. The servants who carried his meals did so in silence, eyes down, terrified of breathing too deeply near the fetid air that hovered around his bed. His voice, once thunder that shook walls and terrified ministers, had grown hoarse and uneven. When he spoke, it came out in bursts of fury and wheezing. Between these outbursts, there were long hours of stillness, when his lips moved without sound, as though he were arguing with unseen visitors. Sometimes he seemed to recognize them. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he screamed. The leg had swollen beyond recognition. The wound, a crater from which the skin had long since receded. The flesh had turned grey and shiny like wax, and the smell was so thick it clung to the clothes of anyone who entered. The physicians did what they always did, burned, drained, bled, but their faces betrayed their despair. The infection had become a world unto itself, fed by the king's own blood, pulsing and breathing with a will that seemed separate from the man it consumed. The swelling spread upward to his thighs, his belly, his chest. His heart laboured under the weight of it all, pumping poison through a system that no longer obeyed him. The once magnificent body that had hunted stags and danced until dawn now trembled at the effort of drawing breath. The palace learned to move around his suffering. Meals were scheduled to avoid his rages. Councils held when he slept. Musicians stationed far enough away that he could hear their playing but not see the pity on their faces. They performed hymns of victory that no longer felt true. The courtiers' laughter in distant halls carried an edge of guilt, for they knew their king could not rise to silence them anymore. He had become both ruler and prisoner, lying beneath embroidered covers that hid the ruin beneath. His every gesture was a shadow of what it once was, a trembling hand trying to reclaim the weight of command. Even his crown seemed to mock him. It no longer fit his head and rested instead on a cushion beside him, an ornament to a power now trapped inside a dying man. There were nights when he ordered the curtains thrown open, demanding to see the moon. "I want the light," he whispered. "I want to see her face." The attendants obeyed, though the cold pierced the room, stirring the stench of his infection into the air. He stared at the night sky as if it were a mirror. The moonlight turned his skin the colour of marble, pale and slick with sweat. "I once thought I could command even that," he muttered. "The sun, the stars, the heavens themselves." His eyes followed the faint curve of light over the Thames. "But they outlive us all." When the chill made him shiver, they closed the curtains again, and he fell silent, his breath shallow and ragged, his eyelids flickering as though he dreamed of battles long ended. His mind wandered through corridors of memory that no one could enter. He spoke to men who had been dead for years. Wolsey, More, Cromwell, cursing them, forgiving them, cursing them again. He called for Jane Seymour and whispered that she was the only one who had ever loved him purely. When fever overtook him, he would suddenly call out for Anne Boleyn, demanding to know why she laughed, why she would not stop. Sometimes he mistook his attendants for his daughters and reached for them with shaking hands. "Mary," he whispered once, "you must forgive your father, for the sin was his alone." And when the girl knelt beside him weeping, He smiled faintly and drifted back into delirium. His past was everywhere in the faces of the living, the ghosts of the dead, the echoes of the music that once filled his courts. The physicians now spoke in low voices outside the chamber, arguing over what to do. They had long abandoned healing and now debated how to prolong the inevitable. They still bled him, still changed the bandages, still prescribed the same useless drafts, because to stop would be to admit defeat. One of them, the youngest, whispered that the king was suffering needlessly, that mercy would be kinder than treatment. The older men silenced him at once. To ease the king's death without his consent was treason. To let him die naturally might also be treason if someone decided it was their fault. And so the doctors continued their charade, attending to the king as though he might recover, though each night they left his chamber, knowing they had merely watched him rot 1 hour further toward the grave. Outside, the people had begun to pray for a new dawn. Rumours of the king's condition spread across London, stories of a corpse that refused to die, a monarch who drank the blood of virgins to preserve his soul, a devil that the church could not exorcise. None were true, yet none were entirely false. For the truth itself had become too grotesque to describe. In the markets, mothers warned children not to speak ill of the king, lest his ghost hear and curse them. In taverns, men whispered that England was ruled by a spirit already half in hell. The palace denied it all. Decrees were issued bearing the royal seal, affirming that His Majesty remained in vigorous health, that his mind was sharp and his heart strong. But those who delivered the messages knew they were carrying lies heavy as lead. Within his chamber, the clock above the hearth ticked endlessly, each strike of its pendulum a hammer against the quiet. Henry watched it sometimes, his gaze fixed on the swinging brass weight, as though hypnotized by time itself. "It mocks me," he muttered one evening. "That little heart that never stops beating." He ordered it removed. But when the servants hesitated, he changed his mind. "No, leave it. Let it count for me." And so the clock remained, marking the seconds of a king who had measured everything in power and found that even power could not stop the turning of gears. The days blurred together until it was no longer clear whether it was morning or night. His skin took on a greyish tint, and his hands, swollen and mottled, trembled like those of a much older man. Yet his eyes, when they opened, still burned with that same command, a dying fire that refused to go out. He ordered the priests to pray louder, to drive away the demons that haunted his dreams. He ordered his courtiers to smile, to act as if nothing were wrong, and they obeyed, because obedience was all they had left. But the walls knew. The stone floors soaked in his sweat. The hangings held the ghost of his scent, and the bed beneath him groaned under the weight of centuries ending. In the silence after each night's last prayer, when the torches dimmed and the servants withdrew, he would whisper to the dark, "If I am to die," he said once, his voice barely more than breath, "let England never forget that I lived." It was not a plea. It was a command to history itself, and history, cruel and faithful, would obey. The final winter of Henry's life came in with thick fog and silence, as if the whole of England had dimmed its light to match his own. The palace was no longer a place of music or feasts or laughter, but a mausoleum that still pretended to be alive. Servants spoke in whispers. Courtiers walked as if afraid to disturb the air. The fire in his chamber never went out. Yet the room felt cold. Smoke clung to the curtains, and the faint smell of rot mingled with candle wax until even the scent of death seemed ordinary. The king himself lay surrounded by relics of power, golden crucifixes, jeweled goblets, portraits of his wives and children all watching him fade. His once massive body had grown monstrous, swollen with fluid, skin stretched and shining like wet marble. The physicians called it dropsy, but to those who saw it, it looked like the sea itself had invaded his flesh, waves rising and falling beneath the surface of his skin. He could barely breathe. Each inhale sounded like a saw cutting through wood. Each exhale, a long surrender that refused to finish. He had stopped trusting his own body years before. But now, even his voice betrayed him. The words came slow, ragged, each syllable an effort. Sometimes he spoke sense orders, memories, half prayers, and sometimes only gibberish. He drifted in and out of lucidity, caught between this world and another. When he was lucid, he demanded to see the future, to know who would guard his legacy when he was gone. He asked about his son, the frail boy who would be king. He asked whether the nobles still bowed, whether his people still feared him. His counsel lied beautifully. They told him the boy was healthy, that England adored its sovereign, that his reign would never be forgotten. The king smiled faintly, satisfied, and then, as if remembering himself, whispered that fear was better than love, that a ruler who is loved can still be betrayed. At night, the fever made his mind a haunted stage. He saw faces above his bed, his wives, his enemies, his victims. They stared down at him, pale and calm, not accusing, not forgiving, simply waiting. He muttered to them, arguing like a man at trial. To Catherine of Aragon, he begged pardon. To Anne Boleyn, he offered denial. To Jane Seymour, he whispered gratitude. But when he saw Catherine Howard, he wept and clutched his chest, as if trying to hold his heart inside his ribs. I did not know. He said to no one. I did not know. The priests told the attendants not to speak of it. A king's tears were not for mortal eyes. And yet, every man in that room would remember the sight of the tyrant undone by ghosts. The leg wound never closed. It leaked until the end, soaking the sheets and staining everything it touched. Sometimes he tried to move it himself, to prove he still could. The bandages would tear, and blood would spread like ink through the linen. The smell was so overwhelming that even the priests faltered in their prayers. But the king would glare at them and growl that God would not be offended by a bit of mortal stink. When the pain became unbearable, he called for music again. The lute, the viol, the soft, trembling notes that once stirred dancers now seemed like funeral songs. He would lie with his eyes open, staring into the fire, as if listening to something only. He could hear a rhythm beneath the music, deep and steady, like a heartbeat approaching silence. The court had begun to prepare for his death, though no one dared say so aloud. Orders were written, sealed, hidden. Messengers waited by the gates to carry word to every corner of the kingdom. His coffin was already built heavy oak, lined with lead, to contain what the living could not bear. The masons at Windsor worked day and night on the vault where he would rest beside Jane Seymour, the wife he claimed to have loved most. But the king clung to life with the stubbornness of iron. Each time the physicians thought his heart had failed, he gasped again, dragging air into lungs that rattled like an empty bellows. He seemed determined to outlive the very patience of death. Sometimes, in the small hours of morning, he spoke of things no one else could know. Visions of fire and stone, of rivers running red, of a crown melting in the sun. The priests told him they were dreams, but he shook his head and said they were memories yet to come. He believed that his blood would never die, that his name would echo forever in the corridors of power, that his sins would be rewritten as victories. England will remember me, he whispered, because it cannot forget me. And then, almost tenderly, he added, "And neither will God." By mid-January, he could no longer leave his bed. The fluid in his body made his limbs stiff and heavy. The sheets had to be changed every few hours. The stench filled every corner of the palace. The servants burned herbs by the door and still could not drive it out. He refused the last rites at first, insisting that he was not dying. A king does not die like a beggar. He snapped, but as the fever rose again, he began to waver. He called for Archbishop Cranmer, the only man he still trusted. When Cranmer arrived, Henry was barely conscious. His lips moved, but no words came. The Archbishop knelt beside him and prayed softly. Then Henry's eyes opened for a moment of clarity that cut through the fog. "Cranmer," he whispered, "if I hold your hand, and I cannot speak, will God know me?" The Archbishop nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He will know you." "My lord." Henry smiled weakly. "Then we understand each other." For hours afterward, he drifted in and out of sleep. The priests continued to chant, their voices rising and falling like the tide. The courtiers waited outside the chamber, silent and pale. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight. The king stirred, as if waking from a long dream, his breath ragged, his eyes fixed on the fire. The attendants leaned closer, but could not hear what he said. Then, very softly, he lifted his hand, reached toward the empty air, and let it fall. A shudder passed through his chest, and the sound of his breathing stopped. The silence that followed was so deep that even the candles seemed to pause. The priests froze in mid-prayer, waiting to be certain, and then Cranmer, kneeling beside the bed, felt the last faint squeeze of the king's fingers before they went still. It was over. The man who had split a church, who had crowned and destroyed queens, who had made his own body the stage of his downfall, was gone. The attendants bowed their heads, not in mourning but in relief, for the long vigil was finally ended. Outside, the fog began to lift, and the first pale light of morning crept through the shutters. No trumpet sounded, not bells rang, only the slow, steady drip of water from the thawing eaves marked the passing of the king, who had ruled England as both god and beast. He had left behind a throne soaked in blood, a kingdom built on fear, and a legacy that smelled faintly, forever, of rot. The news of his death did not travel as thunder, but as a whisper, hesitant and trembling, carried from chamber to corridor, from corridor to courtyard, until even the lowest servant knew that the King of England was no longer among the living. Yet no one dared to mourn loudly. The air inside the palace was still thick with fear, as though his spirit lingered, listening for treachery, even from beyond the grave. The great doors of his chamber were closed, and for a time no one entered. The physicians stood outside, whispering prayers they barely believed in, while the priests crossed themselves again and again, their faces grey with exhaustion. When the council finally entered to confirm the death, they found a scene that looked more like aftermath than repose. The room was cold. The candles had burned low, their wax pooled on the table beside the bed. The body beneath the sheets had already begun its transformation. The swelling of death had set in quickly, the heat trapped within, turning the flesh to something unnatural. His skin was pale and stretched, the mouth half open, as if still trying to command the air that refused to come. The odor was unbearable, the final exhalation of a body that had long been rotting from the inside. Even death had not silenced the corruption, it had only freed it. They worked quickly. The attendants washed the body with wine, though the act was hopeless, for the stench clung to everything it touched. They dressed him in robes of gold-threaded velvet, a garment meant for ceremony, not burial, and placed a jeweled crucifix in his hands. The priests murmured prayers to sanctify the scene, but one fainted before they finished. The council ordered that the windows be sealed, and the door kept locked until the coffin arrived. Outside, the air was thick with rumour. Some said that the king's ghost had been seen wandering near the chapel, others that the candles flickered in strange patterns, spelling out words no one dared to read. None of it mattered. The palace was no longer his. It was a tomb, pretending to be a throne. In the days that followed, preparations for the funeral began. It was to be grand, fitting for a man who had ruled like a god and died like a man. Artisans were summoned to polish the gilt coffin that had been waiting for years. Layers of lead were poured around the body to contain what no prayer could purify. The physicians swore that the king had died peacefully, though every man who had stood in that chamber knew it was a lie. Nothing about Henry's death had been peaceful. The body had resisted stillness, even in its final moments, twitching and heaving as if struggling to escape its own confinement. And now, sealed in lead, that struggle continued in silence. When the procession set out from Westminster, the streets were shrouded in fog. The sound of hooves echoed like muffled thunder on the frozen road. Mourners walked in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. Bells tolled slowly across the city, though even their rhythm seemed cautious, uncertain whether to mourn or to rejoice. The people watched from the edges of the streets, whispering blessings or curses under their breath. They had feared him too long to grieve him honestly. For some, his death was liberation. For others, it was a wound. Children clung to their mothers as the coffin passed. Soldiers bowed, and priests swung censers, heavy with incense to mask the smell. The clouds hung low, and for a moment, the entire procession looked as if it moved not through London, but through purgatory itself. At each stop along the route to Windsor, the coffin rested in a chapel overnight, and the air inside those sanctuaries grew unbearable. The lead casing swelled from the pressure within. The priests said the noises they heard soft groans. Faint crackles were the shifting of the metal as it cooled. The attendants said nothing, but they noticed that each morning the wood beneath the coffin was damp. On the third night, at Sion Abbey, the horror could no longer be contained. The pressure built until the seams of the coffin split. A thick, dark fluid seeped through the cracks, spreading across the stone floor. The smell was indescribable. The priests fled to the courtyard, gagging, their prayers dissolving into gasps. When they returned, the dogs had already found it. They licked the floor where the royal essence had spilled, their tongues clicking against stone. One of the monks fainted. Another vomited. The scene was so grotesque that even the chronicles of the day could only describe it in metaphor: the dogs of Sion feasting upon the flesh of the king. The attendants cleaned what they could and resealed the coffin. Though everyone knew it was only temporary, the decay was too strong, the corruption too deep. The procession continued, slower now, under heavy silence. Those who walked nearest the coffin began to believe it cursed. Each step felt heavier, each prayer more hollow. When they reached Windsor at last, the bells of St. George's Chapel rang out like sighs, echoing through the grey air. The vault prepared for his burial yawned open like the mouth of the earth itself, ready to swallow its king. They lowered the coffin into the tomb beside Jane Seymour, the queen who had given him his long-desired son. It was said that even in death, Henry's corpse faced toward her, as if seeking the one woman he had not destroyed. The ceremonies that followed were extravagant choral hymns, incense thick enough to choke the living, Latin prayers that rose and vanished into the arches. Yet beneath the splendor there was dread, for everyone present knew that the kingdom he left behind was as fragile as the flesh they had just buried. His son, a child, was too young to rule. His daughters, though brilliant, were divided by faith and resentment. His ministers, once united in fear of him, now eyed each other like wolves. England itself trembled, uncertain whether to bless or curse the name of the man who had reshaped its soul. Outside, the crowd lingered long after the coffin was sealed. Some crossed themselves. Others spat on the ground. One old woman whispered that the earth would never keep him still. And perhaps she was right. For that night, the wind rose over Windsor, and the church bells rang without human hands. The guards swore they heard footsteps in the crypt below. A slow, dragging sound, as if something heavy moved within the stone. Whether it was wind or imagination, no one ever knew. But none of them slept. So ended the reign of the man who had made himself both tyrant and god, whose body had become the truest reflection of his soul. Magnificent, corrupted, impossible to contain. His courtiers spoke of legacy, of empire, of destiny fulfilled. But those who had stood in his chambers, who had breathed the air of his final days, carried another story, one that could not be written in ink or marble. They knew that his body had not simply decayed, it had revealed what had always been hidden beneath the crown, a man devoured by his own appetites. Consumed by his own belief in immortality, the church bells finally fell silent. The last candle in the chapel burned down to its wick, and in that darkness, England exhaled, not in mourning, but in relief, as if the entire kingdom had been holding its breath for 36 years, and had at last been allowed to breathe again. In the days that followed his burial, a strange quiet settled over England, the kind that feels more like disbelief than peace. The wind through Windsor's towers carried no music, no echo of rejoicing, only the restless whisper of a people, unsure whether to mourn or to fear what might come next. The court, that glittering machine of flattery and deceit, began to move again, though slower, more cautious, as if afraid that one wrong sound might wake the dead. His ministers gathered in long halls draped with black cloth, signing documents in the name of a boy who could barely hold a quill. The new king was fragile, pale, and obedient, everything his father had never been. Yet the shadow of Henry lingered in every room, in every breath, as though his will still weighed down the kingdom, even from beneath the stone at Windsor. His courtiers spoke softly, as if he might still hear them, for the memory of his wrath was not easily buried. The tomb itself was sealed with iron and prayer, but rumours began before the stone had cooled. The monks claimed they heard sounds beneath the chapel floor faint, irregular, like a distant hammer striking from inside the earth. Some said it was the echo of his restless soul, refusing to sleep. Others said it was the swelling of his coffin, the final rebellion of the body that had defied decay for too long. Guards stationed near the crypt swore that the air grew warmer when they passed, that the scent of smoke and rot still seeped from the seams of the marble. One claimed that, in the dead of night, the candles nearest the tomb flickered blue, and the wax melted backward, climbing up the wick like a living thing. The priests dismissed such talk as superstition, but their faces betrayed their unease. They knew what had been sealed inside that coffin, a man whose sins were too heavy for the ground to hold. London, meanwhile, tried to wash itself of his memory. The people who had trembled at the sight of his banners now spoke his name with caution, as though tasting something bitter. The streets where his soldiers had once paraded stood half empty, the air heavy with the scent of coal smoke and winter rain. The great kitchens of the palace were quiet. No longer did they roast whole boars or prepare pies of peacock and swan. The fires burned lower now, feeding only the needs of a child king. The feasts were gone, but their ghosts remained grease stains on the stone floors. The scent of wine in the wood, the laughter of men who had long since been beheaded. The new reign promised holiness and reform, but beneath the surface, England still carried the mark of the man who had taught it how to hunger. In the countryside, preachers began to weave his story into sermons, not as a warning, but as a justification. They spoke of how he had freed England from Rome, how he had broken the chains of corruption, how even his sickness had been a divine trial. But the old women who listened from the pews shook their heads. They remembered too well the executions, the burning, the famine, the fear. They remembered the smoke over the abbeys, the bells that had been melted for cannon, the priests who had vanished in the night. They whispered that a curse hung over the Tudor blood, that the land itself had absorbed too much suffering to ever be truly clean. At Windsor, the silence of the crypt deepened. The workers who maintained the chapel avoided the lower vaults whenever possible. They said the air was strange down there, thick and heavy, as if it had not been breathed by the living in years. When one of them dropped a candle near the entrance to the tomb, the flame sputtered and died before it touched the ground. Some swore they saw movement in the darkness beyond the gate, not shape, not sound, only the faint impression that something within was listening. The chaplain ordered extra prayers to be said each morning, but the unease never faded. Even the dogs that roamed the courtyard avoided that part of the chapel, tails low, growling softly when the wind blew from the crypt. And yet, above ground, Henry's image was everywhere. Portraits of his broad, triumphant face still hung in the halls of power. Coins still bore his name. In stained glass, he still knelt before God, eternal in posture, if not in spirit. To the world, he remained the embodiment of majesty. The king who had defied the Pope, expanded his empire, and filled his courts with art and music. But to those who had served him, those who had smelled his wounds and changed his bandages, the memory was not glory, it was rot. They remembered the heat of the sick room, the screams during the cauterizations, the look in his eyes when pain stripped away the mask of authority. They had seen a god reduced to flesh, a ruler undone by his own body, and that truth could never be painted over. Years passed, and the legend softened. Chroniclers rewrote his story with elegant phrases. The ulcers became ailments of the leg. The stench became the odor of sanctity. His cruelty was reshaped into the stern justice of a king burdened by destiny. Time, as it always does, turned horror into history. But the truth remained, buried not in books, but in the stone beneath Windsor, a truth that no historian could erase. That the mightiest of kings had been consumed not by war or conspiracy, but by his own refusal to be human. His tragedy was not that he died, but that he spent half his life pretending he could not. Even now, centurilateurs, those who walk through St. George's Chapel sometimes pause before his vault without knowing why. They say the air there feels colder, heavier, as if some echo still lingers. Tourists speak of a faint, metallic scent, like iron and decay, that drifts through the corridor when the wind is right. The guides smile politely and call it imagination. Yet the scent is always there. Beneath the flagstones lies not only a king, but the final warning of an age. That power can command armies, but not time. That crowns can silence truth, but not rot. In the quiet of that tomb, there is no court, no music, no prayer, only the memory of breath that once shook empires. And if the earth listens closely, perhaps it can still hear the faint pulse of the man who believed himself immortal, a rhythm beating softly in the dark, unwilling to stop. Henry's story did not end in death. It ended in decay, the slow collapse of a body that had tried to outlast its soul. And though the centuries have buried his scent beneath incense and dust, his lesson remains as clear as ever that no throne, no power, no godly title can save a man from the consequence of being made of flesh. He broke a kingdom to prove he was divine. In the end, his own body proved him wrong.